Hello. there ought to be some way we can reward those panelists that show up early. I mean, that's very impressive, very impressive. Well, you're setting a great example for these new members that come up here thinking they know everything. Let me go ahead and gavel in. Good afternoon, everybody. Subcommittee will now come to order. I want to thank you all for joining us here today to discuss 8 pieces of legislation pending before the subcommittee with the intentions of benefiting the lives of our service members, veterans, and their families. The bills brought forth by our colleagues today would make additional improvements and changes to the GI Bill and VA's home loan program, as well as provide additional resources for service members after they transition to civilian life. Make minor and technical changes to ensure surviving spouses retain ownership of a service member's small business after they've passed away, and improve the homeless veterans reintegration program administered by the Department of Labor. I will let our colleagues who introduced these pieces of legislation discuss their bills in greater detail, but I do want to briefly discuss the one draft bill on the agenda today that has not yet been introduced. This proposal encompasses the language of 2 bills that we've already examined in this subcommittee and have gone through regular order that would make changes to the home loan program administered by the VA. Part of the bill would eliminate the current conforming loan limit for VA-backed mortgages so that veterans are able to afford homes in higher cost areas. This would not change the underwriting standards currently in place for veterans to become eligible for the loan, but would ensure veterans are not barred from buying a home in more expensive areas of the country due to some arbitrary cap set by the government. This draft also includes language from the bill that Ranking Member O'Rourke and I introduced earlier this Congress to improve the appraisal process for VA home loans by allowing VA-approved appraisers to use the information provided to them by a third-party appraiser for their desktop. This is from their desktop, rather. This proposal would improve the processing time for appraisals so that veterans are able to close on their homes in a quicker and more seamless manner. Lastly, this draft would require veterans who are less than 100% service-connected disabled to pay the funding fee on their VA home loan if they purchase a home that costs more than the current conforming loan, i.e. a more expensive home in a high-cost area. This funding fee would be rolled into the life of the loan and would still be then be allowed a veteran to use their VA home loan with a 0 down payment. I'm eager to discuss each of the 7 pieces of legislation before us today. I'm also grateful to my colleagues who've introduced these bills and to our witnesses who are here to discuss them. Before I yield to my friend and ranking member, Mr. O'Rourke, I do want to briefly touch on the frustration that we feel on the committee, and maybe I should just speak for myself, with the Department of Labor for once again declining to testify at our subcommittee hearing simply because they'd be on a panel of with non-government witnesses. I don't understand that, Mr. Ranking Member, and I'm going to send a letter and follow up. Today's hearing would have benefited from DOL's participation, as there are several bills on the agenda that affect their department and the customers they serve, and our customers are veterans. Notwithstanding this policy by Labor, I do want to thank General Worley and our partners at the VA for participating in today's hearing. And now, finally, I will yield to the ranking member from the great state of Texas for any opening statements he might have.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And in the interest of hearing from our colleagues, I'll waive any opening remarks. Look forward to learning more about these bills and working together with you and other members of the committee to see how we can improve the care and service that we provide to those who have served this country. With that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Messer, since you were here first, I'm going to go ahead and start with you and save the Texan or the best for the last, I
have to admit, I'm a little surprised. I assumed here Texas would just come first, looking at the leadership of the panel, but I appreciate the politeness.
You've got 5 minutes. Yield your time, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Arrington and other members of the committee, members of the Economic Opportunities Subcommittee, including my good friend and a great and distinguished Hoosier, Congressman Jim Banks, for his leadership on this committee and who's also a co-sponsor of the legislation I'm going to talk to you about today. This bill is just a common sense bipartisan bill that provides greater flexibility in the way our veterans can use GI Bill benefits. As we all know, the GI Bill has provided millions of our nation's veterans who have served our country the opportunity to pursue a college degree. As we near the 75th anniversary of the program's inception, it remains one of the most successful federal programs in our nation's history, as it has empowered veterans and their families to pursue their dreams. However, the GI Bill does not cover the cost of one of the first steps towards earning a degree, the cost of applying to go to college. The typical fee for a single college application can now rise to as much as $90, and with school admittance experts recommending prospective students apply to 6 or 8 schools, total application costs can create an unexpected financial burden and a barrier to opportunity with costs of hundreds of dollars per student. The Reducing Barriers for Veterans Education Act would remove this financial barrier by allowing veterans to voluntarily choose to use part of their post-9/11 GI Bill to cover the cost of application fees. This bipartisan bill would not expand the entitlement because the cost of application fees, up to $750, would be deducted from the veteran's overall benefit. Our men and women in uniform deserve a modernized GI Bill. I appreciate this committee's work in that regard. A modernized bill that removes obstacles that our veterans face when they're pursuing a degree. This legislation is a simple common sense change that makes it easier for our veterans to take the first step towards a new career. This legislation has received outside support from Student Veterans of America, Veterans Education Success, the American Legion, and the Retired Enlisted Association. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the entire Veterans Affairs Committee and your team for your work on this important bill. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Messer, and unless there are any questions, I'm going to excuse you unless you want to stay and listen to the eloquence.
Anytime I can listen to Ted Poe, I'm not going to miss that
That's
opportunity.
what I would.
So
you know, most
I may
people
listen to him and then slide out.
Most people would pay to hear what we have to hear from Judge Poe. Judge, we yield five minutes to our friend and fellow Texan.
I thank the chairman, Mr. Arrington, and the ranking member, Mr. O'Rourke, and the rest of the Veterans Committee. And I want to discuss legislation, H.R. 3940, which the ranking member is a co-sponsor of, the Veterans Education Disaster Assistance Act. I'm the son of a World War II veteran. My dad is 93, still very active and opinionated. Served World War II in Germany and came back to Fort Bliss, Fort Polk, and Fort Hood as well. He benefited from the GI Bill. He was not only the first person to go to college, he was probably the first person in our family who could spell college. And after going to college, he became an engineer and did quite well for our family, and it's because of the GI Bill. It's one of the things that Congress has actually done and done right, is the GI Bill. And it has served our country quite well, and veterans like my dad. I'm also a veteran, and I'm thankful for what the committee does for our veterans to receive the best possible care, benefits, and support after they come back from the battlefield throughout the world. 6 months ago, Hurricane Harvey ravaged part of Texas, including most of my congressional district. 130,000 structures were flooded in my congressional district because of Hurricane Harvey. 55 inches of rain in just a few days, and we have had floods since then because of Hurricane Harvey and the repairs that have not been done, which is another story. But anyway, shortly after Hurricane Harvey, Daniel Sublett, a constituent and a veteran of the United States Air Force, he was attending local community college in our district, the Lone Star College of Kingwood. He sought help from our office. Lone Star College was hit hard by Hurricane Harvey, and students could not go there for weeks. 7 of the 9 campuses throughout the Houston area flooded, causing $15 million in damages. Some of those campuses have still not reopened because of the damage. As a response to Harvey, the school instructed its students to take online courses until the school could repair and reopen the physical campuses. Most of the campus was able to come back, and students on September 25th, a month after Harvey was hit. But unfortunately, under the VA's basic allowance for housing, veterans who take online courses are only eligible to receive at most one-half of their BAH when taking online courses as they would if they took the courses in person. So because of this, Daniel Sublett, who is also a local student Veterans of America chapter president, and many other veterans attending Lone Star College in Kingwood were told by the VA that they would only receive one-half of their normal BAH for September and only the month of September. So in many cases, the amount they were told would receive would not even cover the cost of their bills. Although Daniel and a handful of other veterans were able to get a waiver and receive their full BAH for that month, this is not the case for most veterans affected by natural disasters. The VA currently has a waiver that allows veterans to receive their full BAH if forced to take online courses for up to 4 weeks only. This legislation extends that waiver to cover an entire semester. The reality is that it's not always possible for schools to reopen their doors within just 4 weeks because of a natural disaster. Much of Lone Star College Kingwood will remain closed until at least May of this year and may not reopen at that point. So because of that, veterans have left the Lone Star College system. They are seeking admittance somewhere else, and this legislation allows the VA to extend the waiver for a full semester and not just 1 month of that semester. And I will yield back to the committee, and thank you for your support.
Thank you, Judge. Great story, and God bless your dad. And thank you for your service, and thank you, the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Indiana, for your testimony today and your great ideas, and for bringing them to the committee. So you guys, we don't have any questions, and we'll have our next panelists come up, and then we'll discuss it later behind your backs. Mr. Russell, our friend from Oklahoma, we yield 5 minutes for you to talk about your legislative proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the committee. Each year, with the GI Bill, soldiers and warriors that have left the service you try to go get a college education. And it should be a straightforward system, but as we know, it's full of complication. A recent GAO report certainly showed that to be the case. Ideally, a soldier would enroll. The institution says, okay, Russell is enrolling, money comes to the institution, they go to class, they get the college education, money's paid, everybody's happy. It doesn't always work that way. In fact, if the soldier were to not enter a term for whatever reason, maybe he wants to do some work or she wants to do something, then the school is still paid the money. And then you have uncollected funds that have been paid out to the institutions or to the veteran themselves. And then if the soldier were to drop a class, say that they are going, and now you got another construct where monies have been paid for a full tuition load and instead it's a partial tuition load. And all of that really revolves around how do you recoup it and why should you? Now, replete in government, there's nothing in government that is so hard we can't make harder, and we certainly do that with fees. I'm kind of a fee hunter, and this is a fee where we somehow got the notion that a $16, I'm going to charge you to give you your money back fee that institutions are able to do, $16 fee. So VA calls and said, hey, you paid too much out on Russell, he only went to 3 classes instead of 4. And then let's say, okay, I'll give you your money back, but it's going to cost you $16. And we do this to the tune of nearly $13 million in the last statistical year. It's higher now. We don't know what that figure is. Now the institutions are pretty faithful about returning it back, but you would find surprising, or maybe not, that half of all of this unrecouped money revolves around 5% of institutions. So it is an institutional problem. Why should we pay and why should the government be charged to collect something that it was already theirs? And we've heard things like, well, you know, it's a carrot to try to get them to do this and pay back. It's only becomes a carrot because it's allowed. And the issue with this is that if you took the $13 to $15 million it takes to recoup $15 million, we could instead apply that to the average tuition cost of $15,000 to $16,000 per warrior, and the net effect of that is you'd have 832 more veterans that are able to go to school. And so how much does that $16 make sense then? And I know I won't get a chance for cross-examination or questions here, but I would love to have had that opportunity, but I am certainly respectful of the things here. This is the first part of a three-part fix where we are no longer allowing institutions to charge the government to give back what is the government's money that was collected from taxpayers for the purpose of educating veterans, not for the purpose of lining administrations. The first of the fix is eliminate the handling fees, such as this $16 fee. The second would be to require schools to have VA certified officials. Now, this amendment does not address that. It only addresses the first part, because this is low-hanging fruit. Right now, the certifying officials are not certified because they can't be compelled because there's no law that compels them. In many other aspects of whether or not they receive money from other programs for educational purposes, they can be compelled, and they are told to have certain training, so that's part of the fix. And then the third fix would be require schools to apply for tuition payment at midterm, and this, Mr. Chairman, would eliminate 90% of overpay issues. Why? Because instead, they pay the institutions on the promise that they think that the veteran is going to go to school. Things may change upon enrolling day. Things may change on the class schedule in the first few weeks. So we could have an actual construct in the three-part fix, and more to follow, where at the end of that, then we say, okay, at mid-semester, we're going to charge the government on what Russell has actually spent, and then we don't play this drill of spending $15 million to collect $15 million, or $13 million to collect $13 million. We can't fix everything, Mr. Chairman, but we can fix $16 fees that add up to millions of dollars that could educate more veterans. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Russell, for your testimony. Again, thank you for bringing that great idea for us to consider as a committee, and thank you for your commitment and your service to the very best among us, our veterans. God bless you. Thanks for your time. And now I will yield to Chairman Winstrup for 5 minutes to talk about his legislative proposal that we will consider today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and I want to thank Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member O'Rourke for addressing this important bill at today's hearing. I appreciate it. I'd also like to thank in advance all the witnesses for their testimony and sharing their thoughts on this legislation. In November of last year, I joined my colleague and the ranking member of the Health Subcommittee, Representative Brownlee, in reintroducing H.R. 4451, the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Programs Reauthorization Act of 2017. This bill would provide much-needed services to our veterans transitioning to civilian life and ensure no veteran falls through the unintended legislative gaps in programs. We do this by ensuring that those eligible for the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program and other housing assistance programs are also eligible for the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program. The gap arises because the Department of Labor considers veterans participating in these housing assistance programs to no longer be homeless, and therefore ineligible. So as such, they can't participate in the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program. So I think you can see the obvious gap that exists here. So far too often, service members face a number of challenges assimilating back to civilian life as it is. By prioritizing the reintegration of homeless and recently homeless veterans, we will empower our veterans to reenter the workforce and help them regain self-sufficiency. Our veterans obviously sacrifice so much for our country, and I think it's up to us to ensure that they have the tools to succeed in civilian life. I'm proud of this committee's commitment to reducing veteran homelessness, and I'm eager to hear the witnesses' thoughts on this piece of legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it so very much. Thanks again to the chairman and the ranking member, Mr. O'Rourke, and all the distinguished members of the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee, and all the members for allowing me to present this afternoon before the committee. I'm proud of the work that this committee has done to ensure that we as a nation take care of our true American heroes, our veterans, when they return home. Specifically, I'm proud of the work our committee conducted last year to pass the Harry W. Comrie Veterans Education Assistance Act, or the Forever GI Bill. This historic legislation expanded access to education and improves and modernizes the GI Bill for our veterans. But there is always more work to be done for these honorable Americans. I also thank the VSOs for their input. In order to give the best opportunities to our nation's heroes, we must be prepared to address new needs as they are identified. In December, our subcommittee had a chance to examine the implementation of the Forever GI Bill. We heard from stakeholders, such as the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, who expressed concern about the delay payments and processing time for GI Bill benefits by both the school and the VA. I also had a roundtable in my district, and veterans expressed their concerns as well. I also want to thank the staff for bringing this to my attention here, the committee staff. As a result of some of these delays, some schools put on hold a veteran's account or start focusing the student to begin payment of tuition and fees on a payment plan until they receive money from VA. TAPS highlighted occurrences at least 15 schools and universities across the country. In response to these concerns, I worked with the committee to introduce H.R. 4830. The Service Members Improved Transition Through Reforms for Ensuring Progress Act, or the Sitrep Act. My bill would give the Secretary the authority to disapprove courses of education unless the educational institution adopts a policy ensuring that it will permit student veterans to attend those courses beginning on the date on which the individual provides to the educational institution a certificate of eligibility for entitlement to GI Bill benefits. Furthermore, my bill would require that in order for a school or training program to be eligible for GI Bill benefits, the institution must adopt a policy that prohibits them from imposing a late fee, denying access to education, or other penalties due to a late payment from VA. This policy would only apply if the payments have not been received within 90 days of the beginning of the term. Additionally, the Secretary would have the authority to waive this requirement as he sees fit. The Sitrep Act is a common-sense, bipartisan bill that protects student veterans and their families who, through no fault of their own, are denied access to education because the school made a mistake or the VA made a late payment. It is not the fault of the veteran. Again, I want to repeat that. It is not the fault of the veteran. They don't need that excess stress, and they should not be punished for the action of others. Mr. Chairman, I have 3 letters of support for the Sitrep Act, one from the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, one from the Retired Enlisted Association, and one from the Student Veterans of America, which I'd like to ask unanimous consent to include for the record. I have the 3 here, right here.
Without objection.
I promise you they're here. Okay. Thank you very much. In closing, I remain dedicated to ensuring that our nation's veterans have access to the important educational benefits they have earned and deserve. As these brave men and women fought on our behalf, we have a responsibility to do the same by ensuring they are held harmless from bureaucratic penalties and fees. Again, this is a common sense bill. You know, our veterans, they don't need this added stress. And let's take care of this as soon as possible. I urge my colleagues to support this beneficial piece of legislation. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend from Florida, and want to say that if you've got common sense solutions, the EO subcommittee is the place to be, right, Ranking Member? And I want to thank both Mr. Winstrup and you for offering up your ideas to improve services for our veterans. And without any further ado, and I don't believe we have any questions for our colleagues, let's go to our second panel of witnesses today. So if you guys would please take your seats, we'll give you just a minute here. Let me go ahead and make the introductions as you're getting situated. We want to welcome back General Rob Worley, Director of VA's Education Service, who is accompanied by Mr. Jeff London, Director of VA's Loan Guarantee Services. Also want to welcome back Mr. John Cammon, Assistant Director of Veteran Education and Employment for the American Legion, Ms. Ashlyn Haycock, Manager of Education Services for the Tragedy Assistant Program for Survivors, and Mr. Will Hubbard, Vice President of Government Affairs for Student Veterans of America. Again, thank you guys for being with us today, and each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes. So, General Worley, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to provide the views of the Department of Veterans Affairs on pending legislation. With me today, as you mentioned, are Mr. Jeffrey London, Director of the Loan Guarantee Service, and Mr. Tom Laney, Executive Director of Small and Veterans Business Programs, Office of the Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. Because of the timing of the receipt, we're not able to provide formal views on H.R. 1206 and H.R. 3023. We'll follow up with the committee soon on these two bills. Additionally, there are two bills under discussion today which would affect programs or laws administered by the Department of Labor. We respectfully defer to that department's views on H.R. 4451 and H.R. 4835. H.R. 3940, as you heard, would require the VA Secretary to pay a monthly stipend to an individual pursuing a course of education using the post-9/11 GI Bill if that individual is forced to discontinue this pursuit because of the closure of the school due to a natural disaster, and the individual opts to pursue that course or an alternative course of education solely by distance learning. The bill would also require VA to pay an additional lump sum amount for books, supplies, equipment, and other educational costs. Significantly, no charge would be made against the GI Bill entitlement of any individual receiving payment under this legislation. VA supports the intent of 3940. However, we have serious concerns with several aspects of the bill related to disparate treatment of beneficiaries, and we believe the bill needs several clarifications. H.R. 4830 would require a state approving agency to disapprove programs of education unless the institution has adopted a policy allowing the student to attend classes if he or she produces a certificate of eligibility showing entitlement under chapters 30, 31, 33, or 35. The institution would also have to adopt a policy not to impose any penalties such as late fees, denial of access to facilities, or requiring the student to borrow funds to pay tuition because of delayed payments from VA. VA supports this bill as well, but also has some concerns with it. VA does not make tuition and fee payment directly to institutions under Chapters 30 and 35, but rather pays the monthly benefit payments directly to the student. Consequently, as currently written, individuals entitled to assistance under Chapters 30 and 35 would always be permitted to attend for 90 days, regardless of when VA begins issuing benefit payments, in order for the institution to avoid program disapproval. H.R. 5044 would allow a surviving spouse of a veteran whose disability rating was less than 100% to be treated as a covered surviving spouse for purposes of VA contracting goals and preferences for a period of up to 3 years. While VA supports the intent of this bill, changes must be made before VA can support it. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017 will amend the relevant provisions in 38 U.S.C. Section 8127 to mirror those set forth in the Small Business Act. Accordingly, VA recommends that the proposed amendment be incorporated into the Small Business Act. There would be minimal or no costs associated with this bill. The draft home loan bill would make various changes to VA's home loan program. Section 2A of the bill would adjust the maximum guarantee amount under VA's home loan program. However, the uncertainty in budgetary impacts because of that, VA cannot support Section 2A at this time. Section 2B of the bill would change the exemptions permitted with regard to VA's statutory loan fee. Due to the way this provision is drafted, it's unclear to VA which veterans Congress intends to exempt from paying the loan fee. VA welcomes the opportunity with this and all the legislation, the education legislation, to work with the committee to make sure that your intended outcomes are provided in the language. VA supports enactment of Section 3 as it would enable VA-designated appraisers to expand their coverage areas and would increase the number of appraisals they could perform in a timely manner. This concludes my testimony. We appreciate the opportunity to present our views on these bills, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General Worley, and I apologize, Mr. Kamen, for mispronouncing your last name. Kamen. Mr. Kamen, you have 5 minutes. Thank you on behalf of the American Legion for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. On behalf of National Commander Denise Rohan and 2 million members of the American Legion family, we provide our strongest commendation to this subcommittee for the extraordinary job it's undertaken honing in on the challenges and solutions to veteran successful transitions. In just the last 4 months, you have convened roundtables and hearings on improving TAP, VA home loans, and tackling veterans homelessness. And has never been an echo chamber. You've held us all to task, from veterans organizations to our government and community partners. We will begin with GI Bill and H.R. 4830, the Sitrep Act. This bill would require schools to adopt policies that disallow them from imposing late fees or other penalties to beneficiaries due to late payments from VA. The American Legion applauds Congressman Bill Arakis for addressing this important issue. On a personal note, I remember a late VA payment when I was in school, leading to questions about whether I could still attend my classes. My student veterans organization at the time, AU Vets, was able to successfully lobby our institution to update their internal policies to allow myself and other veterans to continue our studies. But TAPS deserves credit for championing this bill by recognizing that this should not fall to student veterans to lobby for. It should be mandated by principle. The American Legion enthusiastically supports passage of H.R. 4830. Turning our attention to small business, we have H.R. 5044, the Service Disabled Veteran Small Business Continuation Act. Amongst the range of benefits our country has developed to provide transition assistance to disabled veterans has been set aside contract benefits for companies considered service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. The 2017 NDAA specifies a surviving spouse may continue to operate a company as an SDVOSB when a veteran dies under certain conditions, such as that they had a disability rated as 100% disabled. H.R. 5044 would expand this criteria to give surviving spouses with less than total disability ratings the option of maintaining SDVOSB status for 3 years. The American Legion supports this as a measure to improve and increase benefits bequeathed to veteran spouses upon a veteran business owner's death. Concerning the Transition Assistance Program, we have H.R. 4835, the Job Tools for Veterans Act. This bill would provide a new 5-year pilot program and establish 50 centers across the country to expand access to job resources and ensure the Department of Labor provides classes with job training information. The American Legion supports this bill, but would be remiss not to share concerns on VA's TAP obligations. In last week's budget testimony, the Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Benefits shared that the 2019 budget request cut $59.3 million from the VRNE program due to favorable pricing of a Transition Assistance Program contract. Notwithstanding the question of how precipitous of a drop this actually is, we were under the presumption that TAP had been moved to the Benefits Administration Service, not VRNE, and would appreciate clarification from the VA. It's in this context of questions that I'd like to provide our feedback on these programs, along with today's release of the American Enterprise Institute's report on economic opportunity, transition assistance, and the 21st century veteran. With the incredible energy that this subcommittee has invested into defining veteran success, I owe you the American Legion's unvarnished conclusion on the totality of these discussions. Programs designed to empower veterans' abilities will not reach their full potential under the aegis of an administration dedicated to documenting veterans' disabilities. What we risk with the status quo is an economic opportunity office encumbered by the premise that it's just another benefits delivery system held to comparable standards as disability compensation. And if we've learned one thing from all of our discussions over the past term, is that these programs have the potential to be so much more than benefits. With proper oversight, they can be true investments in the future of our country. In its limited time, the Office for Economic Opportunity has piloted and demonstrated success for many programs, from public-private partnerships for apprenticeships and employment to the creation of VA for Vets and the Veterans Employment Services Office. VA Center for Verification and Examination has grown exponentially and curates an extensive database of verified veteran-owned small businesses. But so long as there remains a claims backlog, they always compete for relevance and funding. The landscape of education benefits has evolved rapidly with the implementation of the Harry W. Comrie Veterans Educational Assistance Act. These improvements have been accelerated immensely by the research that Student Veterans of America has conducted on veterans' education outcomes, most recently with its National Veterans Education Success Tracker. While their success is rightfully applauded, it should not be on the young VSO's back to prove the success of a VA program as monumental as a GI Bill. As the demands of the veterans' populations change, so must the agency that helps ensure their success. As our Legislative Director, Matt Schuman, shared last week, the American Legion believes the time is right to consolidate VA's economic opportunity programs under an Undersecretary for Veterans Economic Opportunity and Transition. Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, distinguished members of this committee, the American Legion appreciates the opportunity to comment on these subjects, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kamen, for your testimony. Now, Ms. Haycock, we yield 5 minutes to you. Thank you for being here.
Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of surviving families of our nation's fallen heroes. I am the surviving daughter of Army Sergeant First Class Jeffrey Haycock, who died in the line of duty in 2002, and Air Force veteran Nicole Haycock, who died by suicide in 2011. In 2010, I was one of the very first recipients of the Marine Gunnery Sergeant John Fry Scholarship, and for that opportunity, I am incredibly grateful to this committee. TAPS would like to thank the committee for all of the provisions in the Harry W. Comrie Veterans Educational Assistance Act that assisted our surviving families, such as Yellow Ribbon for Fry Scholarship recipients, the removal of the delimiting date for Fry-eligible spouses, and an increase in Chapter 35 educational benefits. We look forward to seeing these implemented in the coming months. However, with these improvements coming from the Forever GI Bill, we are concerned about potential delays in payments. That's part of the reason H.R. 4830, the Service Members Improved Transition Through Reforms for Ensuring Progress Act, or Sitrep, is so important to TAPS, and we are incredibly grateful to Representative Bilirakis for introducing it. We have already had situations where veterans and survivors were forced by many schools to take out student loans, sign up for payment plans they could not afford, or required to pay out of pocket for tuition before the start of the term. These students did everything by the book. They applied for and received a certificate of eligibility. They provided that certificate of eligibility to the school certifying official with proof of enrollment on time, yet they were still penalized because of unfair institutional policies. One of these students, Weston, is enrolled at Montana State University. Because the VA tuition payment had not arrived before the start of the semester, the school advised him to take out a student loan and repay it when the VA money arrived. They did not inform him that there would be thousands of dollars in initiation fees he had to pay back on top of the original loan amount. The VA money arrived when it was supposed to, 4 weeks after being certified by the school. But nevertheless, Weston was punished. Another student, Timothy, started his first semester at Blinn College in College Station, Texas in January 2018. Timothy was raised by his grandparents after the loss of his father in the Army in 2004. He transferred to Blinn after his grandfather had some medical issues, so he could be closer to home. Timothy provided Blinn with his COE the day he enrolled in classes, yet his grandparents were still forced to pay out of pocket that day while awaiting VA payment. This payment put such a strain on the family's finances that they were late on other bills that month. Then we have Yesenia, a surviving spouse who was enrolled at a small private university, Aurora College in Illinois. Yesenia did not pay out of pocket or take out loans up front for her tuition, but because of when the VA payment arrived, she was forced to pay late fees on top of her tuition. When she confronted the school about it, they told her it was not their problem. These are just some of the examples we have heard. None of these examples came from delayed payments, just unfair institutional policies. Imagine how many more there could be if payments end up being delayed with the implementation of the changes from Forever GI Bill. Sitrep does nothing more than make a certificate of eligibility a promise of payment. It prevents schools from punishing students using the post-9/11 GI Bill, Fry Scholarship, and VOC rehab for the complications of bureaucracy. It prevents military-connected students from taking out unnecessary student loans, accruing late fees, and being financially burdened by forcing them to pay out of pocket. These policies are already in place for students using Title IV funds, such as Pell Grants and federal student loans. We view this as a straightforward, common sense bill, just like the guaranteed in-state tuition laws passed in 2016 by this committee. While TAP's priority here today is H.R. 4830, we would also like to express our support for H.R. 1206 to assist with application fees, H.R. 3940 to assist veterans and survivors impacted by natural disasters, and the draft text to create a fourth administration for economic opportunity. We are, however, concerned with H.R. 3023, which eliminates reporting fees, as this does away with some of the important gains from Forever GI Bill. Veterans and survivors have already sacrificed so much for this country. Simplifying access to higher education for them is something we can easily do. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important issue, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Haycock. Now, Mr. Hubbard, you have 5 minutes for your remarks.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting Student Veterans of America to submit our testimony on the pending legislation before this body today. With over 1,500 chapters representing more than 700,000 veterans in schools across the country, we are pleased to share the perspective of those directly impacted by the subjects before this committee. Many of the topics under consideration focus on the issues of transition, education, and employment. Before delving into these topics, we would like to address the ongoing situation with Ashford University. At this time, it is unclear what the Department of Veterans Affairs, in conjunction with the state approving agencies, intend to conclude regarding the case. At present, Ashford effectively has no current approval for GI Bill funds, while the school continues to seek approval in several states, including Arizona and California. As the situation remains unclear, we support the intent of VA at minimum to stop new enrollments of GI Bill students until the situation is resolved. Historically, we have provided direct support to student veterans and their families who have been displaced from tenuous education situations. Resolving this situation as soon as possible is in the interest of students and all those involved. As Forever GI Bill implementation is ongoing, we recognize the constraints on the VA, the Education Service staff specifically, and we applaud Director Rob Worley and his team for the incredible commitment to the implementation of this historic legislation, as well as the other economic opportunity programs. Our full review of the legislation appears in our written testimony. VA has publicly stated, quote, economic competitiveness is not just about employment. It encompasses overall employment, wealth, independent living, housing, career mobility, and educational attainment. Economic opportunity being a stated priority, we propose the establishment of a Veterans Economic Opportunity Administration at VA, including the creation of a new political appointment for an Undersecretary of Veterans Economic Opportunity. Responsibilities would include the administration of the Home Loan, Vocational Rehabilitation and Employment, or VRE, education assistance programs, and transition issues. This proposal would have a laundry list of much-needed outcomes. First, it increases accountability. As of this hearing, it has been 886 days since VA last had a permanent Undersecretary of Benefits. As of today, VA has no permanent leadership overseeing these important issues. Second, it elevates economic opportunity for veterans. It's directly relevant to President Trump's Executive Order 13822, supporting our veterans during their transition from uniformed services to civilian life. This proposal supports the importance of transition, education, employment, and well-being. Third, it reduces bureaucracy, which has historically led to serious national challenges. Keeping economic opportunity issues buried at the bottom of the Veterans Benefits Administration is not the answer. As of last week's budget hearing, the lack of a clear response on several basic questions regarding multiple economic opportunity programs at VA was a direct result of a structure not functioning to benefit the end user. Take a look at the current structure. It's no wonder that economic opportunity programs are taking a backseat at VA, and that's just one lane within VA. At the bottom, you'll see GI Bill listed. It's pretty clear that this is not a structure that's set up to support the veteran. Fourth, it establishes a counterpart for the Departments of Defense and Labor. Presently, these departments lack a direct undersecretary counterpart within VA, and any significant initiative must achieve multiple layers of approval before moving ahead. Fifth, it supports whole health. A tragically elastic narrative exists around veterans as either broken or damaged. In reality, the vast majority of veterans are much like many Americans, hardworking, community-oriented neighbors who want what's best for their families. Unfortunately, programs that support the whole health of veterans are not reaching their full potential under this current structure at VA. Disappointingly, it appears that the maintenance of the bureaucracy is the chief concern for those who are opposing this proposal, placing an emphasis on preserving the way things are for the sake of doing so versus the prioritization of the customer, veterans. A long list of traditional and post-9/11 military and veteran service organizations have supported this concept in the past and continue to do so today. Future generations of veterans are counting on the success of this proposal, and we're eager to work with this Congress, the President, and all others in making this a reality. I'll leave you with this quote: "The nation that makes a great distinction between its scholars and its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools." Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee for making the success of student veterans and their families a top priority in this Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Hubbard, for your passion for our veterans, especially our student veterans, and it's always good to see you. Now I'm going to begin our committee remarks and questions with my ranking member, Mr. O'Rourke. I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kamen, you had a specific question. You had some uncertainty, I believe, on TAPS program. You wanted a clarification. Do you want to re-ask the question and allow Mr. Worley to answer?
Yes, thank you, sir. The question related to, in the hearing and also in the budget request for FY 2019, it was mentioned that VRNE, in terms of where the budget was dropped, the rationale for that was that a new TAP contract could deliver better outcomes at a cheaper price. The question we have is, why would a TAP contract have anything to do with VRNE? Because TAP is under the BAS office, so we're wondering how that math was crunched to do that.
Okay. General Worley, any light on that?
I can't shed any light on that.
Okay.
Ranking Member O'Rourke, we can certainly take that back and try to answer that question. It's true the TAP program is managed under the Benefits Assistance Service. Yeah. So that's all I can share at this point.
And just since we have everyone at the same table, the question brought up about Ashford College by Mr. Hubbard. Anything you can say about that?
I can share a couple of things about the status of Ashford University. As you may know, there's Ashford filed suit against the VA, and so there's ongoing litigation in federal court. So there's probably not a huge amount I can say, but it is true that through the legal interactions, Ashford did apply for approval in the correct state of jurisdiction, which is California. They do have, they would argue, an approval status in Arizona and in Iowa, for that matter. It's a good time to point out that state approving agencies approve programs of education for GI Bill benefits, not the VA. And so California has essentially decided not to act on that approval, which is tantamount to denying the approval. And the VA is currently reviewing, we FOIA'd and are reviewing all the approval documentation to determine the appropriateness of California's action under our contract with them and whether Ashford acted in good faith in pursuing that approval.
Let me ask you one more question. Mr. Poe's legislation to assist those veterans who are living in places like Houston, who are still trying to obtain their earned education benefit despite living through a natural disaster, perhaps their schools closed down. You had two concerns. One was disparate treatment, and you said I will need some clarifications. Anything that we can resolve today as long as we have all parties at the table?
Well, we noted that the bill only applies to post-9/11 GI Bill, so there are 5 other benefit programs that we administer.
Could we open it to all 5, and your concern would be?
I think
eliminated?
They would be subject to the same weather and potential closure issues, so if you opened it up, that would be helpful. It was unclear with respect to in-between terms, whether this would apply in between terms of education. And there was also a concern related to the books and supplies, because the way we pay it now is a flat rate, $1,000 a year maximum. The way this language reads is there's really no maximum, no cap. It's pay for whatever is required. So we would suggest that there be a cap or something similar to what's in place with the normal program.
Yeah, and I don't know if Mr. Poe's team is still here or if they're watching, but I'd love to work with his office, with you, and see if we can't resolve those concerns and get the support of the administration, because I think all of us want to do this. The intent is the right one, and the concerns that you have seem legitimate. We want to make sure there is not disparate treatment, and every earned beneficiary is able to get this help. So it seems very reasonable. Okay. So I'll ask my team to work with.
We'll be happy to work with the committee.
Judge Poe's team and the VA, and I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank the ranking member. I second his comments on Mr. Poe's legislative proposal, and hope we can find the technical remedies for that would address those concerns so we can move it forward. And Mr. Rutherford, from the great state of Florida, I yield 5 minutes for your questions. And by the way, they called votes, so we've got the 15-minute mark. I'm going to stay behind and wrap up, but you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and I'll be very quick. I'll just have a couple quick questions. American Legion supports the 1206 Reducing Barriers for Veterans Education of 2017. This authorizes a GI Bill funding to be used to pay for college application fees. Does anyone know, General, maybe you do, how many veterans actually expend all of their GI Bill dollars? Do we know what percentage?
It's a very small percentage. I don't know the level of fidelity of our data, but it's in the low single digits as we understand it today.
So this would be probably a full increase in expenditure, because you're actually adding dollars that
correct. There would, and apologize, we don't have the approved views and costs for that, but we'll have that shortly to be able to provide to the committee.
Okay. Very good. And then finally, on 3023, do we know of any other organization that pays for processing to a college? I mean, it seems to me that that's in there, that would be in the college admissions covered by their fees and other charges within their credit hours.
I appreciate the opportunity to address that, Congressman. And while we don't have the official views on that particular, you're talking about the reporting fee.
Correct.
I just want to clarify what those fees are for. Those are authorized, and those are based on the number of active beneficiaries at a particular school. And the purpose of those fees are to support the school certifying officials or other costs, whether it be reporting to the VA or other, that's why they're called reporting fees. And what they do is help defray some of the costs that the school incurs by being a GI Bill approved school. In many cases, those funds support the school certifying officials attending training conferences, which is a hugely valuable way to use that money. So really, those fees are used for those kinds of things in support of the Veterans Program at the school and in training with the VA.
Okay.
And the state-approving agencies as well.
Anyone on the panel aware of any other organization that gets reporting but doesn't pay for it?
Yep. Sir, I'm not aware, but I think there's a unique history when it comes down to reporting fees. Prior to 1976, the people who certified veterans were actually employed by the VA. Someone who ensured they were on campus, they were going to class, and we still see the vestiges of that exist today through the VOC rehab program. That is a VA staffer who is certifying that they check in, all right, you're in social school, all right, great, here's your payment. After 1976, with the proliferation of the Vietnam-era GI Bill and some other people on campuses, reporting fees were instituted to defray costs. So it was a way to cut down on the burgeoning staff with the VA by saying, all right, schools, if you can take care of this for us, we'll reimburse you for $7 at the time. Since that time, it's gone up to $16, and the schools, and with the Forever GI Bill, we've actually earmarked those to say the money that you're getting needs to go directly back into the certifying official budget for training purposes and things of that nature. So it's definitely a little bit odd, but
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Let me follow up on follow on some of your questions. And again, guys, feel free to go. They've called the votes. But as a former administrator in a higher education institution, I'm always curious about these fees. The universities benefit greatly from the GI Bill benefits, the full tuition and fees. They build into that their operating costs, their overhead, and I'm just having a hard time figuring out why they need an additional $16 fee. Let me ask you, do you know that the federal student assistance programs in Department of Education, Title IV programs, do they also come with an additional reporting fee? Does DO, General Worley, maybe you're the best.
I'm sorry, I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
I don't know if they.
I don't recall that they have an additional offsetting assistance to the university, and in this case, in that case, I'm not sure that they're getting the full freight. I think the GI Bill is much more valuable to the university, so it may be an oddity in my view, but again, I haven't done a lot of due diligence. And it seems to me, again, the incentive for the institution is to recruit and support veterans because they're all about the students, but also the revenue that follows. And I just don't know why you would need the $16 reporting. I'm calling it fee, but support from the federal government, from the VA, from the taxpayer. Any comments, Will, on that, or anybody on the panel want to comment on that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So our strong position is that we believe that schools should continue to get the fee. I think, however, schools are making the wrong argument. They're not demonstrating the return on investment with this fee, and with the Forever GI Bill, we had to specify what these fees needed to be used for, which in and of itself, I think, demonstrates a cultural challenge. Schools typically were taking this funding and rolling it into a general operating fund, which is not what it was intended for. And I think if they could demonstrate the value of what these fees are providing, for example, allowing them to more effectively and efficiently recruit student veterans to universities, I think that would be a strong case and would allow us to understand that better.
See, I think performance-based funding is actually where I'd like to go, just to be very transparent. And it gets at a lot of my colleagues who aren't here that express, especially Mr. Takano, his concerns, and I think legitimate concerns about predatory practices and some institutions that might be taking advantage of our veterans. Again, I think not only should we, once you get the full tuition and fee, which is a heck of a deal for a university, I think the university should compete and compete by building into their service support services for our veterans and anything else that will allow the veterans to benefit from. But let that market unleash that, and I think you'll have folks bending over backwards to get our veterans and to support them as non-traditional students. So I'd actually go the opposite direction on this. But the Messer H.R. 1206, his proposal, I'd like your thoughts on that as well, Mr. Hubbard, but anybody can comment. To me, it seems like if somebody wants to use their 36-month of tuition and fees and draw that down and use those resources for application fees and maybe accelerate their track to graduating, that's an option. And I'm all for options and choices for our veterans, and they're responsible. I don't know another community more responsible to make that decision. Why shouldn't we give them the freedom and the choice to do that?
It's an excellent point, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I strongly believe, and as an organization, we've seen instances where there are barriers for student veterans to apply to schools. Anytime we can reduce those barriers, as the name indicates, all the better. If it's a small $90 to $100 fee that's preventing somebody from going to school, because the reality is when you're an E2 or E3, I mean, that's significant money. If you have a family to feed and you're trying to cover the cost of bills, I mean, that's not insignificant to those individuals. So I think taking the opportunity and allowing those individuals the opportunity to go to school, all the better. We fully support this.
My last question, and then we'll close. And by the way, Ms. Haycock, thank you for your family's sacrifice for our country, and we're so grateful. And to the line of questions and comments that you had on Mr. Bilirakis's legislative proposal, H.R. 4830, Mr. Worley, I recall that your processing times were pretty good, like 6 days on average, maybe for supplemental, 20-plus days, I think 22, 24 days maybe on original. Is that correct? Do I recall accurately?
You've got a good memory, but that was before the peak season we just went through. The fiscal year-to-date numbers right now are about 22 days for originals and 12 days for supplementals.
Okay.
That goes up a little bit during peak season, and now it's coming back down.
Okay. The Forever GI Bill, that y'all have to make a lot of accommodations and adjustments in your systems and your overall operation to implement it and to execute on it, and make sure that there aren't the delays. Obviously, with your average time, it'd be an outlier to make the 90-day window that is the solution that Bilirakis is introducing. How do you feel about where you are in terms of the ability to efficiently and effectively execute and implement the GI Bill, the Forever GI Bill?
Mr. Chairman, we're working very, very hard to make sure that there aren't the delays that have been expressed here in terms of, especially 1 August 18, when there's 17 more provisions that go into effect. Overall, I'm feeling pretty good. We've got the IT work going on that will handle the most critical things, as we've testified before, with respect to housing. We are well underway with the planning for the vet tech and the things that happen a little bit later. But it is true that where we don't have the IT ready on 1 August of 18, we're going to have either workarounds or procedural advisories or those kinds of things. Those are being designed now. We'll be doing the training and we'll put those into effect. And we have more people coming in as well. So we'll have about 200 additional folks to help make sure we try to maintain the timeliness we enjoy today.
I think the ranking member's right is here, so I'm going to wrap up. So do you think it's a good stopgap measure to have that 90-day Bilirakis solution?
Yes or no question?
Yes.
Good. I ask unanimous consent. That was a subtle hint. That written statements from Rep. Chabot of Ohio, the Department of Labor, the National Association of State Approving Agencies, and the National Association of Veterans Programs Administrators be included in the hearing record without objection. So ordered. Finally, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on any of the bills under consideration this afternoon. Without objection, so ordered. The hearing is now adjourned. See you, buddy. Yeah.